So what's Molinism?
If someone were to ask me, like when they say, what is that? I kind of give them like, I guess like a Molinism test, which I think is pretty simple enough. Because interestingly, Thomas Flint and Craig have alluded to this, that Molinism seems to be Flint says it's the view of the proverbial man in the street. It's a view that everyone kind of already assumes. And even Molina said that he was just unpacking and making it a little more clearly things that people already held to theologically and philosophically. Okay. So I like to ask people this. I'll ask you. Do you think God knows what your life would have been like had you had one more brother or sister?
I'm not sure.
Fair enough.
I'm playing hard to get, aren't I?
No, no. It's okay. I figured you might go there, because most people who haven't thought of it are going to say yes, because they believe in a really powerful, perfect being, right. Like some people who can't answer that question. So we'll put it this way, because I can answer both, and then we go back to the question I asked. Most people they'll say yes, and then my next question is, did God know this before He created anything? And they say yes. Well, then you have middle knowledge. And in essence, Molinism is really the idea that God possesses middle knowledge, and I'll explain that in a second, and He chose to create this world on the basis of that middle knowledge. You also asked when I kind of first identified. Like I said, I think everybody kind of already assumes that, but more specifically, I remember when I kind of discovered and stumbled onto, and then I later saw Craig argue this, that middle knowledge seems to be entailed by the definition of omniscience. So the definition of omniscience is simply that God knows all true propositions or statements, if you want. He knows all true propositions and doesn't believe any false ones. Well, take the proposition, and there are different types of propositions when it comes to the wording of them. So today, Erik is eating Taco Bell, and that is true, right? That's a present tense proposition. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, Erik, let's say, did not eat Taco Bell. That's true or false. It's a proposition. And any proposition that is true or false, God is going to know them. He knows past tense, present tense, and then we can say tomorrow, Erik will eat Taco Bell. That's true or false. And because it's true or false, God must know it. And then you have what are called counterfactual propositions. So if Erik were offered Taco Bell tomorrow, then he would freely take it. Now, it's called counterfactual. One reason is because, let's say no one offers me Taco Bell tomorrow. Well, that doesn't negate the fact that if it were offered to me, I would take it. So if counterfactual propositions are true or false, and God, by definition of omniscience, must know all true propositions, then it follows He would know counterfactual propositions. And again, if God doesn't learn anything, and if we're going to set open theism aside, then God would be necessarily omniscient from eternity past. He's never had to learn anything, so He knew this logically prior to creation. Well, then, to me, there you go. You have middle knowledge. You have the core of Molinism. And then it would just make sense that God is going to create a world on the basis of what He knows. So then you just have Molinism there.
All right, there's a lot to unpack already, and I'm trying to figure out if I want to go broad. Maybe we go broad before we go narrow and deep. So God has this knowledge of counterfactuals, and this knowledge, according to you, is prior to the creative decree or the creative act. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. So yeah, I can unpack that more if you want.
Well, so let me ask. So couldn't the Calvinists say the same thing? Now, I'm not a Calvinist, but the Calvinists could say the same thing, right?
It depends. So technically, yes, they could. And this is why I make a distinction between the kind of the doctrine of Molinism and the application of Molinism. Now, Thomas Flint and others will say that, for Molinism to be true, you need libertarian freedom and middle knowledge. I don't think so. Or something around those two. I don't think so. I just think you need middle knowledge and then providence, or God's decision to create the world based on this. So to what you're saying, yes, a Calvinist can say that God, and when we talk about middle knowledge, we're talking specifically in this context about what are called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Basically what any libertarianly free creature would do in any given circumstance. And to just kind of give more context to that, Molina broke up God's knowledge in three, what he called logical moments. Mm-hmm. These aren't temporal moments. They're logical moments. Just like the number 2 comes before the number 3 logically, not temporally, so to speak. So first you have God's natural knowledge. Essentially, God knows all possibilities, everything that's logically possible. So God knows that if I were in this situation, I could do A or I could do not A, right? But note that knowing what I could do doesn't tell God what I would do. So natural knowledge, God knows all the possibilities or every possible world, to use those terms. And then so far, everybody would agree there. Then you have, let's jump to the third one, and that's God's free knowledge. And it's called free knowledge because it's based on his free decision to actualize a specific world. We might call that foreknowledge. So Molinists, Arminians, and Calvinists all agree there on those two. God's natural knowledge, God's free knowledge. Where they may disagree would be that middle knowledge. Now, remember I said that middle knowledge, this is just like natural knowledge. In God's natural knowledge, he doesn't decide what is true or not true in that moment. Because the number 2 is even and 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's a necessary truth. So it's not under God's will. He can't will that to be true. Middle knowledge would be the same in that sense. That he doesn't will what is true or false in this moment. This is going to be up to free creatures. Free knowledge, now that is dependent on his will. Where the Calvinists could agree is that, yes, God has this middle knowledge. He knew what any world of free creatures would have been like, but he didn't like any of those options. So he decided to create a world in which determinism is true. And thus you have God's middle knowledge, his creation based on his middle knowledge, but you don't have people with libertarian freedom. So the Calvinists could agree there and be a Molinist. However, most Calvinists seem to have, and I say this somewhat jokingly, a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of libertarian freedom. So much so that sometimes, like Wayne Grudem in his systematic theology, which I'm not too fond of, but he basically says, anybody, I'm paraphrasing, anyone with libertarian freedom when it would be outside of God's providential control, and that's impossible. So if you had libertarian freedom, you wouldn't exist. So he's basically arguing it would be logically impossible for God to create a libertarianly free creature. The Calvinists could deny middle knowledge by denying the possibility of the existence of libertarianly free creatures. Like, as I'm sure you've heard some Calvinists say, nothing is out of God's control, but by that they usually mean causal control. And so if they're libertarianly free creatures, that would somehow undermine God's sovereignty. Given God's sovereignty cannot be undermined, you're not going to have libertarianly free creatures, not even God's knowledge of them, because it's a logical impossibility. On the other hand, they also might throw out something like a grounding objection and say that if there were libertarianly free creatures, then it wouldn't be logically possible for God to know what they would do. So then they would deny middle knowledge on that front. So if you're going to deny middle knowledge, you're either going to have to deny, let me put it the way I think it. It seems you're going to have to deny God's omnipotence and argue he cannot do something like create libertarianly free creatures, because if that's a logical possibility, then you're denying God's omnipotence or diminishing it. And in turn, his sovereignty, which is what Molina argued about Calvin. He said, which God is more sovereign, a God who could create a world and accomplish his goal through the actions of free creatures, or a God who could only accomplish his goal by causing the actions of his creatures? And it was obviously the former for Molina. So you're going to either have to deny that or deny or diminish God's omniscience, as I would say the open theist does, where you're going to say there's something that God cannot know because there's some kind of modal thing. But that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, basically, if the Calvinists will affirm that, he can do it in the way I said it. But most Calvinists are going to have a problem with libertarian freedom, so most would deny middle knowledge for that reason.